The pipeline is already in the ground. The oil is already flowing. The deal is already signed. And the entire Western sanction strategy, years in the making, backed by the most powerful economies on earth, celebrated in press conferences and parliamentary chambers as the decisive economic weapon of the 21st century, is staring down the barrel of something it never fully prepared for. Not a military threat, not a cyber attack, not a currency war, a pipeline, and the single most consequential energy partnership in modern history. One so vast, so structurally deep, and so deliberately constructed that it makes the word sanctions start to feel like a bluff that has finally been called. This is not a story about what might happen. This is not speculation dressed up as analysis. This is a story about what has already happened, what is happening right now, and why most people haven't been told the full, unvarnished truth about what it means for the future of Western power, global energy markets, and the very concept of economic warfare itself. On September 2nd, 2025, Russian President Vladimir Putin sat across from Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing, and the two men did something that sent quiet, ice-cold shockwaves through every foreign ministry, every treasury department, and every geopolitical think tank in the Western world. They signed what Gazprom's own chief executive called the largest, most ambitious, and most capital-intensive project in the global gas industry. It was the legally binding memorandum for Power of Siberia 2, a natural gas pipeline that will funnel 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas per year directly into the heart of northern China, every single year for 30 years. That moment didn't just mark a commercial transaction. It marked the formal, public, undeniable declaration that Russia and China have together built themselves an exit door from Western economic pressure. And they have been quietly constructing it for years, brick by brick, pipeline by pipeline, while the West sat back and celebrated its own sanctions as a winning strategy. To understand how we got here, and more importantly, what it actually means for the decade ahead, you need to go back before the pipeline, before the invasion of Ukraine, before the sanctions. You need to go back to the moment the seed of this entire arrangement was planted. Not in some smoke-filled boardroom, but in a geopolitical wound that never fully healed, and a calculation that one side made far earlier than the other realized. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the first serious wave of Western sanctions hit Moscow, something happened that the West read as a clear sign of Russian weakness, but was actually the opening move in a completely different chess game. Russia looked east. Specifically, Russia looked at China, the world's largest energy consumer, the world's factory floor, a nation that burns more coal, more oil, and more gas than any other civilization in the entire sweep of human history. And Russia made a decision that would take a decade to fully mature. If Europe wants to squeeze us out, we will build a new customer. A customer so enormous, so energy hungry, and so strategically positioned to absorb Russian exports at scale that no amount of Western pressure will ever be able to matter again. The result of that 2014 pivot was the original Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, a $400 billion deal struck in May 2014, immediately following Russia's annexation of Crimea that went fully operational in 2019. It runs over 1,400 miles from Russia's Chayanda natural gas fields deep into northeastern China's Heilongjiang province. That pipeline alone, at full capacity, delivers 38 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year to China. By 2024, that number was being pushed toward 44 billion. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the velocity of this shift. In 2021, Russia supplied just 10% of China's total gas imports. By 2024, that number had climbed to over 25%. That is not a trend. That is not a blip. That is a structural transformation of one of the most important energy relationships on Earth. And it happened quietly, steadily, and almost entirely below the radar of mainstream Western media coverage. Now here is where the numbers start to become genuinely staggering. Because this story is not just about gas. The energy relationship between China and Russia covers crude oil, coal, liquefied natural gas, pipeline gas, and a shadow infrastructure of financial systems, tanker fleets, payment networks, and alternative currency mechanisms that have been purpose-built over years to circumvent every major tool in the Western sanctions arsenal. And when you begin to add all of that together, the cumulative projected value of this energy relationship across decades of pipeline contracts, oil flows, coal shipments, and LNG agreements already inked, you begin to understand why serious analysts and strategists describe this as an $8 trillion strategic architecture. It is not a single payment. It is not a single deal. It is the total compounding long-term strategic weight of an energy partnership, engineered specifically to make Russia economically unsanctionable, by redirecting the entirety of its export base toward the one buyer on Earth that the West fundamentally cannot afford to fully confront. Let us start with the oil, because that is where the most dramatic story lives, and where the most revealing data sits. Data that paints a picture that official Western narratives have been reluctant to tell in full. When Western nations imposed a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian crude in December 2022, the theory behind it was elegant in its simplicity. Cap the price, choke the revenue, drain the war chest, starve the conflict. The architects of this policy were genuinely confident. The assumption was that Russia had nowhere else to go. It assumed that the major buyers of Russian oil, the nations with the refining capacity, the port infrastructure, the sheer demand, would either comply with Western pressure or find themselves cut off from the Western financial system. And while Europe largely did comply, dismantling most of its Russian seaborne crude import infrastructure with remarkable speed, two enormous economies did not comply. India stepped in and began importing Russian oil at a steep discount, reselling refined products back into global markets at a comfortable profit. And China. China did something even more structurally significant than India. From December 2022 through all of 2024, more than 2 full years of sanctions enforcement, China absorbed 47% of all Russian crude oil exports. Not a portion, not a marginal share. Nearly half of everything that Russia pumped out of the ground and loaded onto a ship went into Chinese refineries. Russia surpassed Saudi Arabia as China's single largest crude oil supplier in 2023. By 2024, Russia was delivering an average of 2.2 million barrels of oil per day to China, accounting for 21.5% of China's total crude imports. Take a moment to sit with what that means in practice. The world's single largest oil-consuming nation was, at the height of the Western sanction regime, sourcing over a fifth of all its crude oil from the country that those sanctions were supposedly crushing. That is not a loophole. That is a structural failure of the containment strategy. And here's the mechanism that made it possible, because China did not simply walk into a market and buy Russian oil on the open exchange. There's an entire parallel infrastructure, some of it deliberately constructed, some of it emerging organically in response to market incentives, that was built to move this oil completely outside the reach of Western financial systems and Western-backed insurance and shipping networks, shadow fleet tankers, vessels operating with deliberately opaque ownership structures, registered under flags of convenience in obscure jurisdictions, with their automatic identification systems switched off or spoofed to disguise their true locations, began carrying Russian crude across open ocean. By November 2024, S&P Global estimated that this global shadow fleet had grown to represent 17% of all oil tankers on the face of the earth. Most of the Russian oil moving through that shadow fleet was destined for a single cluster of ports along China's eastern coastline, specifically in Shandong province, where a dense network of independent refineries, known in the industry as teapot refineries, absorbed the crude and processed it into finished products for the Chinese domestic market, and, in some cases, for onward export. The pricing mechanism worked in everyone's favor, except the Western nations doing the sanctioning. China got deeply discounted oil, sometimes trading at $15 to $20 per barrel below global benchmark prices, a discount so large it represented billions of dollars in annual savings for Chinese industry. Russia got volume, cash flow, and strategic lifeline. The price cap was being structurally bypassed, not through any single dramatic act of defiance, but through a market mechanism that the sanctions themselves had inadvertently created. By making Russian oil politically radioactive to Western buyers, the West had effectively handed China and India a permanent, sustained discount on a commodity that both countries needed desperately to fuel their industrial economies. Now, here is where the story demands honesty, because this is not a simple narrative of total Western failure, and presenting it as such would be misleading. Western sanctions have not been toothless. They have drawn real blood from real arteries. The question is whether that bleeding is fatal or merely painful, and the answer to that question is where the most important analytical debate of our time is playing out. On January 10th, 2025, the United States Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated 2 of Russia's most powerful and profitable energy companies, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas, as sanctioned entities. Alongside these designations, it sanctioned 183 shadow fleet vessels and the insurance companies that underwrote them. The market response in China was immediate and measurable. Chinese state-owned enterprises, the large integrated oil majors including Sinopec, PetroChina, and Zhenhua Oil, scaled back their purchases of Russian crude almost overnight, spooked by the credible and specific threat of secondary sanctions that could disconnect them from the American financial system on which their global operations ultimately depend. In the months that followed those January designations, the volume of Chinese imports of Russian oil fell 9.1% compared to the equivalent period in 2024. Russia's share of China's total crude imports dropped from a peak of 20% in early 2024 to 17% by the third quarter of 2025. Urals crude, Russia's primary benchmark export grade, saw an immediate and painful price drop. The spread between Urals and the international benchmark widened sharply, meaning Russia was taking less money for every barrel it managed to sell. The Kremlin felt it. And the financial data from Gazprom told an even starker story. Net loss of $7 billion in 2023, the first loss the company had recorded since the year 1999. Then, a net loss of $12.89 billion in 2024. A company that had been one of the most profitable energy corporations in the world for 2 decades, now hemorrhaging capital at a scale that threatened its basic operational integrity. Russia's own industry and trade ministry, conducting an internal survey of major exporters and economic advisors about what concessions Moscow most needed in any peace negotiation, found that energy sanctions and payment system restrictions sat at the very top of the list. That is not diplomatic posturing. That is the sound of real economic pain. But pain is not the same as collapse. And a sanctions strategy that inflicts pain without achieving its central political objective is ultimately a strategy that has failed on its own terms. Because the architecture that China and Russia have built together, across years, across multiple energy sectors, across financial systems and shipping networks and alternative payment mechanisms, has enough redundancy, enough structural depth, and enough long-term strategic weight that partial enforcement cannot unwind it. Every time a new sanction designation lands, traders adapt. New shipping routes emerge. New intermediaries appear in new jurisdictions. And critically, the teapot refineries in Shandong province, the independent operators who lack the same global financial exposure as China's major state-owned oil companies and therefore have far less to fear from secondary sanction threats, kept buying Russian crude through all of it. In some cases, they actively increased their purchases even as the big state companies pulled back. The network is not a single point of failure that can be taken down with a single well-aimed sanction. It is a distributed, adaptive, resilient system. And it was built partly by circumstance and partly by deliberate design to survive exactly this kind of sustained pressure. The payment architecture tells the same story. When Western banks made it progressively more difficult and more dangerous to process dollar-denominated payments for Russian energy exports, the trade simply migrated. China began paying for Russian oil, gas, and coal in Chinese yuan, renminbi, rather than in dollars. This shift was commercially significant in the immediate term, but its long-term geopolitical implications are even larger because it began chipping away at dollar dominance in one of the highest volume commodity markets on Earth. Beyond the yuan, something even more remarkable began emerging. Cryptocurrency entered the Russia-China energy trade as a practical, operational payment mechanism. Chinese buyers of Russian crude began paying in renminbi to offshore middlemen who converted the funds into cryptocurrency, moved the assets across borders outside the traditional banking system, and reconverted them into Russian rubles on the Moscow side of the transaction. Russia's foreign minister publicly encouraged the use of cryptocurrency for international trade in 2024, after Russia passed a law explicitly legalizing the practice for cross-border transactions. The entire Western sanctions architecture was constructed in an era when dollar dominance gave Washington and Brussels extraordinary near-total reach into the financial infrastructure of any country that conducted significant business in dollars, which, until recently, was essentially every country. Cryptocurrency represents a direct structural challenge to that assumption. The European Union, watching this financial evolution unfold in real time and feeling increasingly outmaneuvered, took its own dramatic step in July 2025, and in doing so, crossed a threshold that would have seemed genuinely unthinkable just 12 months earlier. For the first time in the history of Western sanctions against Russia, the EU directly sanctioned 2 Chinese banks, Haihei Rural Commercial Bank and Heilongjiang Suifenhei Rural Commercial Bank. Both were small regional lenders. The choice of targets was deliberate, small enough to sanction without triggering an immediate, full-scale confrontation with Beijing, but large enough to send a clear signal that the West was now prepared to target Chinese financial institutions directly for facilitating Russia's energy trade. China's public response was measured. But behind the diplomatic restraint, the signal that the West had now moved onto Chinese financial territory accelerated the very dynamic it was trying to reverse. It pushed Beijing further, faster, into constructing financial infrastructure that operates entirely outside Western visibility, Western regulation, and Western enforcement reach. And then there is the gas. The gas is where this story reaches its most consequential, its most durable, and its most structurally permanent dimension. Because unlike oil, which can be rerouted through different shipping lanes, repriced through spot markets, and managed with relatively short-term commercial adjustments, pipeline gas is different in kind, not just in degree. Once you build a pipeline, you are committed. The steel is in the ground. The compressor stations are built. The contracts are signed. The relationship is locked in for decades. And on September 2nd, 2025, that lock-in became legally binding, publicly announced, and strategically irreversible. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline if it is constructed to its planned full capacity and operated at even 50% utilization, will add 50 billion cubic meters per year of Russian gas flowing into China annually. Layer that on top of the expanded power of Siberia 1, delivering 44 billion cubic meters, and the Far Eastern pipeline route expected to come online in 2027 and add a further 10 billion cubic meters, and you arrive at a total potential Russian gas supply to China of over 106 billion cubic meters per year when all three projects reach capacity. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia was exporting more than 150 billion cubic meters of gas annually into European markets. Europe's lost market, the continent that had been Russia's most lucrative energy customer for decades, is being rebuilt in the east. Not fully replaced, not yet, but substantially, structurally reconstituted across a new geography, under new contracts, with a new anchor customer who has very different strategic interests than Europe ever had. The geopolitical logic for both countries is so precisely aligned that it makes the arrangement remarkably durable. And that durability is what makes it so consequential. For Russia, the calculus is existential in the most literal sense. With European gas markets functionally closed, the critical Ukraine transit agreement that had carried Russian pipeline gas westward through Central Europe for decades expired at the end of 2024, severing a revenue stream worth billions annually. And with Gazprom recording losses that would have been unimaginable just 3 years ago, China is simply the only buyer on Earth with both the size and the political willingness to absorb the scale of Russian gas that now desperately needs to find a market. The Yamal Peninsula fields in western Siberia, the same fields that will feed power of Siberia 2, were always so productive, so vast in their reserves, that they were difficult to fully absorb, even when Russian-European gas trade was at its historic peak before the war. Now those fields need a new home for their output. China is that home. For Russia, this is not merely about revenue. It is about giving Gazprom a reason to exist. A guaranteed 30-year pipeline contract with the world's largest energy consumer is something that no amount of Western pressure can easily unwind once it is operational. For China, the logic runs equally deep, but operates from a position of structural strength rather than existential desperation, and that asymmetry is the most important power dynamic in this entire relationship. China is not doing Russia a geopolitical favor. China is not acting out of ideological solidarity or anti-Western sentiment alone. China is executing a carefully considered, decades-long energy security strategy that has been a core pillar of Beijing's national planning since at least the early 2000s. The Strait of Malacca has always been Beijing's strategic nightmare, a narrow, easily blockaded shipping choke point through which the overwhelming majority of China's oil and LNG imports must physically transit on their way from the Middle East, Africa, and Australia. Any serious military confrontation with the United States or its Pacific allies could theoretically see that strait effectively closed, cutting off China's entire seaborne energy supply within weeks. Overland pipelines from Russia represent something qualitatively different. Energy that arrives by land, through territories that are not subject to naval interdiction, not vulnerable to aircraft carrier battle groups, not dependent on the freedom of the high seas. For China's military planners and strategic analysts, every additional billion cubic meters of gas arriving by overland pipe from Russia is one less catastrophic vulnerability in a potential high-stakes confrontation with American naval power. China's natural gas demand is projected by major energy agencies to peak somewhere between 2035 and 2040, reaching somewhere in the range of 600 to 620 billion cubic meters per year as the country industrializes further and transitions away from the most carbon-intensive fuels. If power of Siberia 1, power of Siberia 2, and the Far Eastern route all achieve full operational capacity by the early 2030s, Russia alone could be supplying approximately 17% of China's projected peak gas demand. 17% is not an overdependence. It is a strategic cornerstone, a reliable, geopolitically controlled, militarily invulnerable baseload supply that gives Beijing extraordinary energy security while simultaneously giving it leverage over Moscow that no Western power currently possesses. Because here is the truth that the Russian side of this story consistently underplays, and that some Western commentary is equally reluctant to state directly, China holds the better hand in this relationship. Russia needs China in a way that China does not and has never needed Russia. That fundamental structural asymmetry gives Beijing the power to dictate the commercial terms of this partnership in ways that consistently and deliberately favor the buyer over the seller. And Beijing has exercised that power with patience and precision at every stage of the negotiations. This played out directly in the decade-long Power of Siberia 2 negotiation. China spent nearly 10 years. Analysts at Chatham House and Carnegie described it as playing very hard to get, refusing to give Moscow a final investment decision on the pipeline. Beijing kept the negotiations alive without ever fully committing, Knowing with precision that Russia's deepening desperation, its mounting financial losses, and its increasingly limited alternatives would eventually force Gazprom to accept terms that China found commercially attractive rather than merely acceptable. Bloomberg's reporting confirmed that the gas price agreed for Power of Siberia 2 will be lower than what Gazprom currently charges its remaining European customers. Russia got volume, revenue, and enormous political symbolism it could parade domestically. China got cheap gas, strategic energy diversification, and proof of concept that it could build an energy security architecture entirely outside Western control. That is not a partnership of equals. That is a patient, decade-long exercise in strategic leverage, executed with the kind of long-horizon discipline that Beijing has consistently demonstrated and that Western governments, operating on 4- and 5-year electoral cycles, have consistently failed to match. Timothy Ash at Chatham House captured the dynamic precisely when he noted that Xi Jinping had likely used Russia's desperation to secure better pricing terms and had now calculated that by adopting a firm, unwavering stance toward Western pressure, the West would eventually be forced to accommodate Chinese interests rather than the other way around. That meta-calculation is the real strategic heart of this story. China is not just buying discounted Russian gas. China is demonstrating, to itself and to every other country watching, that it can absorb Western pressure on behalf of itself and its strategic partners, and that the Western sanction architecture has a ceiling, a limit beyond which it cannot go without triggering consequences that would harm the sanctioners as much as the sanctioned. The coal dimension adds yet another layer that deserves careful attention, because coal was supposed to be the easy one. It was supposed to be the commodity where Western sanctions worked cleanly, where the numbers told a clear story of effective enforcement. The European Union imposed a full coal import ban from Russia, which went into effect in August 2022. It was the first major commodity ban and was widely reported as a decisive step. And Europe did indeed stop buying Russian coal. That part worked. But the story did not end there. From December 2022 through all of December 2024, a continuous span of more than 2 years during which the EU coal ban was fully in force, China purchased 46% of all Russian coal exports. Almost half of everything Russia dug out of the ground and exported went straight into Chinese ports. India took another 17%. Turkey took 10%, South Korea took another 10%. The buyers were there, the market did not disappear. It simply rerouted itself around the Western embargo with remarkable efficiency, finding new customers who had no legal obligation and no political incentive to honor European preferences. Russia's coal revenues did eventually crash to their lowest level since the invasion in December 2024, falling to 42 million euros per day, down 19% in a single month. That number represents real damage. Revenues significantly below pre-war levels, a genuine cost imposed by sanctions. But 42 million euros per day is still 42 million euros per day. Still billions of euros per year flowing into Russian state revenue from a commodity that sanctions were supposed to have effectively neutralized. The geometry of global trade shifted completely. New shipping routes opened. New port infrastructure was developed. New commercial relationships were established. And the shifting happened with enough speed and enough completeness to prevent the kind of catastrophic total revenue collapse that the sanctions architecture was originally designed to produce. The LNG story contains one of the most politically charged revelations in this entire saga. Russia has a large, formally sanctioned liquefied natural gas project called Arctic LNG 2, an enterprise that Western nations have been attempting to commercially kill since 2023 through a combination of direct sanctions, insurance restrictions, and diplomatic pressure. Western insurance companies withdrew. Western engineering firms walked away. Western shipping companies refused to provide vessels. And yet, in 2025, China began accepting LNG cargoes from Arctic LNG 2 anyway. The head of China Energy Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Michael Maiden, responded to this development with a directness that cut through all diplomatic language. The message is, China is no longer even pretending to comply with U.S. sanctions or care about what the West thinks, and it's not alone. Stutz. That is not an expression of hostility toward China. That is a sober, factual reading of where we are geopolitically and what the acceptance of those LNG cargoes signals about the state of Western leverage over Beijing's decision-making. The global implications of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline extend far beyond Russia and China in ways that are only beginning to be fully modeled. The Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy found in its September 2025 analysis that even at 50% utilization, a Power of Siberia 2 pipeline coming online in the early 2030s could extend the expected global LNG supply glut of the late 2020s, driving down benchmark prices across the entire market, narrowing the supply-demand gap that American and Qatari LNG exporters are counting on to make their own multi-billion-dollar investments commercially viable. and potentially preventing some proposed American LNG projects from ever reaching a final investment decision. This means the Russia-China energy architecture is not a contained bilateral arrangement between two countries that can be safely isolated from the broader global market. It reaches into LNG pricing. It reaches into American energy export economics. It reaches into European energy security planning. And it does all of this from a structural position that Western governments have very limited practical tools to reverse, because the tools that could reverse it, genuinely confronting China economically over its energy trade with Russia, carry costs that no Western government has yet shown a willingness to pay. There are important, honest caveats to register, because telling this story with integrity means acknowledging both sides of the ledger. Western sanctions have not been the strategic failure that Russia-friendly commentary sometimes claims. They have inflicted real, measurable, sustained pain. Gazprom's losses are real and damaging. The 9.1% drop in Chinese oil imports from Russia following the January 2025 designations demonstrated that aggressive, specific, well-targeted secondary sanctions can move markets and change behavior, even in China. The state-owned enterprises did pull back. Russia's own government identified energy sanctions as the concessions it most urgently needs lifted. Power of Siberia 2 remains years away from delivering its first cubic meter of gas. The full pricing terms are unresolved. The construction financing is uncertain. Russia will almost certainly never fully recover its lost European gas revenues, even when every pipeline project reaches full operational capacity. The combined 106 billion cubic meter projection still falls meaningfully short of the 150 billion cubic meters Russia once shipped annually into European markets. And China is emphatically not Russia's unconditional patron. Beijing has maintained deliberate, calculated distance throughout, accepting Arctic LNG-2 cargoes while keeping its largest state banks carefully away from direct sanctions exposure, signing the Power of Siberia 2 memorandum while leaving final pricing deliberately unresolved to preserve negotiating leverage, deepening the energy relationship at every level, while ensuring that Moscow understands with complete clarity that China controls this partnership and will extract maximum value from it. The fact that China stopped buying electricity from Russia entirely as of January 1st, 2026, even while deepening every other energy dimension of the relationship, is a data point that illuminates this dynamic perfectly. This is a managed, instrumentalized partnership. Not an alliance of equals, and not an unconditional commitment. But even with every one of those caveats fully and honestly on the table, the strategic picture is unmistakable. The West built a sanctions regime designed to isolate Russia economically, drain its capacity to sustain conflict, and force a fundamental change in its behavior. That regime has caused real damage, but it has not achieved the central objective that justified its construction. Russia has not changed its behavior. Russia has not collapsed economically. Russia has pivoted the structural core of its energy export infrastructure toward a buyer that the West cannot sanction into compliance without triggering consequences, economic, financial, and geopolitical, that would devastate Western economies alongside the intended target. And in doing so, Russia has bought itself the time, the revenue flow, and the strategic cover to persist far beyond the timeline that Western planners originally projected. The deeper question, the one that will define Western strategic thinking for the decade ahead, and that policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and London are only beginning to genuinely grapple with, is not whether the China-Russia energy axis is real. It is undeniably, irreversibly, structurally real. The pipeline memorandum is signed. The oil is flowing at millions of barrels per day. The coal is moving across the Russia-China border in quantities that make the European ban look like a minor commercial inconvenience. The shadow fleet is operating across open ocean. 17% of all global tanker tonnage moving sanctioned crude to buyers who have no intention of stopping. The yuan payments are being processed. The cryptocurrency conversions are happening. And the gas architecture, the most permanent, most consequential, most geopolitically significant piece of the entire puzzle, is being engineered, funded, and built with the full commitment of two of the largest governments on Earth. The question that matters now is whether the West can construct a sanctions strategy and a broader geopolitical posture that actually accounts for this new reality. One that either finds a genuine, sustainable way to impose costs on China for facilitating Russia's energy trade at scale, or honestly accepts that the traditional sanction model has reached a structural ceiling it cannot break through, and begins developing fundamentally different strategic instruments suited to the era ahead. Neither path is easy, neither path is without significant cost. But continuing to celebrate a sanctions regime as successful, while the entity it is targeting builds a 30-year energy partnership with the world's largest economy, is a form of strategic self-deception that history will not be kind to. What September 2025 made clear in Beijing, in the bilateral meetings, in the legally binding memorandum, in the 22 signed agreements, In the words of Gazprom's CEO standing before cameras and describing a project of genuinely unprecedented global scale in the confident body language of two presidents who clearly believed they held the stronger position, is that the era in which Western sanctions could be reliably treated as a decisive, self-sufficient, comprehensive strategic instrument against any country with a willing and capable alternative partner has ended. Not faded at the margins, not weakened in certain sectors, ended as a dominant paradigm. The pipeline is in the ground, the deals are signed with legal force, the oil is flowing at over 2 million barrels a day. The gas architecture is being engineered, financed, and constructed with the full political commitment of both Moscow and Beijing. And the Checkmate, executed not in a single dramatic moment of confrontation, but across a decade of patient, methodical, incremental construction that the West watched without fully comprehending its ultimate destination, is already on the board. The pieces are placed. The position is set. And the most consequential question in global geopolitics right now is not whether the West can reverse this. It is whether the West is even prepared to honestly acknowledge what it is looking at. The game is not over. Sanctions still have a role. Enforcement still matters. The strategic competition is not concluded. But the rules have changed in ways that cannot be wished away. The board has been fundamentally permanently rearranged by $8 trillion worth of pipelines, contracts, tankers, WAN payments, and 30-year commitments. And the West, its institutions, its policymakers, its strategic establishment, is only beginning, slowly, reluctantly, with the particular difficulty of systems built for a different world to fully reckon with exactly what that means for everything that comes next.